Great. As we see more people coming in, we will just have you joining us, but Liz and I are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are in conversation with Liz Dozier from Chicago Beyond, the founder and CEO of Chicago Beyond. And my name is Carrie Hansen. I am the Vice President of SOCAP. And SOCAP is also the organization that is bringing Spectrum Virtual to you next week, the 9th through the 11th, focused on a conversation around reducing the racial wealth gap and racial equity and social justice issues. And this conversation is a beginning and a prelude into that conversation. And it is also turning into a conversation that's reflective of our moment right now. And before we get started, I did want to take a few minutes to have us ground for just a moment and center. So if you feel comfortable, I would love to have you close your eyes, take a couple of deep breaths. And we'll take a moment of silence for about 10 to 15 seconds before we go ahead and move into our programming. Everyone come back. I think as we were preparing for this, one of the things that Liz and I talked about just briefly is wanting to recognize not only this moment, but all of the other moments, the small moments and the large moments that have led to this one, to this not only conversation that we're in, but this moment in time. And I think, Liz, I'm going to turn it over to you. We've done a little bit of pivoting of this lightning bolt. It will still be a little bit of a lightning bolt in the fashion that it will be reflective. There will be some provocation here that we want to discuss. But what we were finding is that we really needed to take a little bit of time to process and to really have a bit more of a conversation around what is happening and how we are pivoting ourselves in this moment and in the world. And we'll have this be not only a conversation between Liz and I, but then also all of you. So please do feel free to start sending your questions and comments, and we will be using those and surfacing those throughout our conversation. But Liz, why don't you go ahead and get us started, please?
Yeah, thank you so much, Carrie, for having me here and for really grounding us before we get started. I'm sure, like many of you who are watching from your homes or wherever you're at, like that moment is so necessary and needed, as there is so much happening in our world today, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, as our conversation flows. But just wanted to thank you for acknowledging not just the present moment, but also the past and all the past moments that have led us here today. So like Carrie mentioned, we had plans to really double click into COVID-19, and we had plans to talk about the disproportionate effect that was having on communities of color, and specifically here in Chicago, but really across the country, on African Americans and what that meant. And then we stepped into a new moment of time. And so we thought it's best just to have a conversation on that. And what I'd like to do first is maybe just introduce a little bit about the work of Chicago Beyond, but also how what's happening in our country, where there's a moment for us, I think, as individuals, but also as a collective to really step up and step into anti-racism and step into actual action steps that really move us forward. And I think there's a place for all of us, regardless of what your race is or how you orient in this work. So first, I guess, let me back up and introduce myself. I'm Liz Dozier. Like Carrie mentioned, I am the founder and the CEO of Chicago Beyond, but I'm also a former teacher and principal and an activist as well. I, along with my team, was responsible for the work at a high school called Finger High School, where we worked primarily with Black children and essentially turned around an entire school. And that work was really taken from the stance of restorative justice and taken in the stance of humanness and how do we all work together to best support kids. After I left there, I started the organization called Chicago Beyond, which Carrie mentioned. And essentially we're an impact investor and we back the fight for young people and we back the fight for equity. And we invest in ideas and organizations that support those Black and brown young people. And so for us, it looks like everything from, our, most recent work of our COVID-19 response, where we're supporting families across our city, almost 6,000 to 7,000 families on any given week with like food and basic necessities, because that is what our communities have called for, all the way to some of our work before that and supporting African-American leaders, African-American fathers, and really supporting the growth of their work to support our communities as a whole. So excited to engage in the conversation, but just want to acknowledge that as we think about this moment here, as we all know, structural racism set the stage long ago for what we're seeing now. And I think that applies in this COVID-19 moment, but also in the moment that's happening as a whole. And like a virus, structural racism has controlled parts of our city and cities like ours in our country for generations. And it's caused, as we know, vast disparities in health, economic mobility, education access, housing, I mean, you name it. Whether it's redlining in the 30s and 40s to what we see now with even small Black businesses being able to get loans. The fault lines, as I see them, have always been there. We just as a society as a whole have either become good at ignoring them or having little workarounds around them. But I do believe that in this particular moment, this is where opportunity lies, and opportunity, like Carrie and I we were talking about this earlier, to really tear down and to rebuild and to call out the inequities that we see and really call in something that is radically different. And I think honestly, Carrie, I think we need to excavate. And I think first is like anti-racism. It is not good enough to say that, I'm not a racist. It is really about like being an anti-racist, and we can dig all into that later. But the second is about even how we think about decision-making and evidence. I think that, we all know what's happening in terms of the systemic problems and the structural biases that have persisted. But we also need to change our orientation in how we produce and analyze and use and figure out what evidence is valid to make our decisions. There have historically been voices that have been left out of that equation of how we even think about producing evidence to drive decision. And the third piece I'll say is really around narrative. And it's what stories that we're telling, honestly, and in whose stories we're telling, but also like who gets to tell the story and how they shape that story. And I think these 3 points are really important because they're not the end all be all, but I believe that as we think about this excavation, it's important that we keep these at the center. I truly believe that we're in the moment of a revolution, something I thought I would never see in my lifetime. Maybe I would see, if I have kids, my kids' kids would see, but we're in that moment. And we have a real opportunity to shift and utilize that moment to create a new future. So that's what I'll say.
Excellent. Absolutely. I agree too. I mean, I was just saying earlier before we started, I was having a conversation with a girlfriend of mine, and I said, I did not believe that in my lifetime, I would see the possibility for for real change. And I now have some hope that is truly possible. And I think it is the actions and some of these conversations that we actually do need to have about what needs to change, and not only what, but how do we go about changing. And so I would be curious if we could start there on some of the pieces. When you think about not only the what, but the how of the work that we should all collectively be in, and the work that you and Chicago Beyond have been doing with the Chicago community, how is that changing, and what needs to change in maybe short term and long term formats or timeframes to allow for some of this true excavation and then rebuilding to happen?
Yeah. And I want to hear your thoughts on this too, because I think this is where we need to ground and give people really practical steps of what to do. I really believe what we're seeing now with our protests is people trying to ensure that we are eradicating systemic racism, and they're trying to do it from the top down. And I think that is valid, and that we should all be in that movement. And at the same time, I think there's also these mini movements that we need to be in that are right in front of our faces. And that is what's happening in our own homes. Whether we're a teacher or whether we're a parent, we have the opportunity to really dismantle structural racism and systemic racism from the bottom up with our children. People aren't born racist. It is taught. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there in very practical terms. I also think we need to support, efforts to eradicate voter suppression. I mean, what is happening with voter suppression across our country is absolutely incredible. And I think is at the very core of limiting people's voice and access to power. And so I think that's a very practical step. And also, as simple as it sounds, I think it doesn't often happen, but acknowledging and hearing Black voices and Black people's stories. I think, for far too long, our stories have sort of been pushed aside or marginalized or not taken seriously. And it wasn't until, I think, in very recent times, from my perspective, when we started having videos and more technology to record stories, that people, began to believe and really understand the severity of some of the things that we face. And so I think just hearing the story, and then actually being and taking an anti-racist stance, understanding race and racism, but then actually doing something about it. And we all have a role to play there. I think it's time out for this idea of being neutral, or not taking a real action.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say I agree. One of the things that I am finding that I am very much missing with COVID in the pandemic. I have an 8-year-old daughter, Eleanor, and she's not in school, and I'm really missing our school community. We are in a very, very not only diverse, but then diverse thought and diverse community wise. And it has always been a social justice community in school. That's part of what they have taught. And I just know that I am very much missing the support of that community and some of the conversations that we would all be having in different ways. And we just actually 2 days ago received a link from our teacher saying, here is a resource for you to be able to talk to your kids about not only the protests, but the racial inequities that are happening right now. And I found that to be very valuable. And we have been, so thinking about some of these some really tactical, tangible things, we have been, discussing this at the dinner table. It's just part of the flow of our conversation, and being able to have that conversation in a way that's developmentally appropriate, and being able to be very open and honest about it. I think it's part of that critical conversation of ensuring that some of the unconscious bias that has been transferred, to me, as an adult and as a parent, that I unlearn that, and that I also then ensure that I'm not placing that also onto my daughter going forward.
Yeah, I think it's a process. It's such a good point about how it's a really a process for all of us of unlearning. I mean, it is like in the air. Racism is just it is in the ecosystem in which we operate. And we do have to unlearn. I don't know if you saw the article or the op-ed that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did. Did you see that he wrote in the LA Times?
It was incredible.
So powerful.
I'd see if I can go get it, and I'll drop it in
Yes,
the link here. Yeah.
So good. The piece that I loved the most, there's so many just like solid nuggets in there, but the piece that was so powerful to me is that he's talked about racism being like dust in the air. And he said, you don't even realize it's invisible and you're choking on it. And it's not until you let the sun in that you see like it's literally everywhere. And you have to keep shining the light in order to see like where exactly it is landing in order to be able to clean it and clear it, and that you have to be vigilant with it. And I think that is so true, because it is truly everywhere. And so the acknowledgement that you're describing of having to unlearn, because I think we all do, whether we are people of color, whether we're white, like we all are ingesting this, and so we have to be vigilant and understand the idea of unlearning.
Not only unlearning, but I think there are also pieces here around action and steps, and again, like those really tangible. What I've been hearing in almost every call that I've been doing lately is this question around, well, what can I do, and what kind of action can I take? And I'm just curious to hear from you, like, what are you hearing as you are in conversations, not only with your local community, but others around the country? What are you hearing around the real need and hunger that people are experiencing right now?
Well, I think people are trying to figure out what their role is. I think of folks I've been hearing from who are white, and trying to understand what it means to be an anti-racist, and what's the difference between anti-racist and just, I'm not a racist. And I think that involves really, it involves the acknowledgement, understanding of a white person's privilege in this country, and how they've, and as we all have, internalized racism, and their responsibility to interrupt racism when they actually see it, whether that's in the workplace or in friends' comments or it shows up literally in everything. And for people of color, I think it means recognizing how we've internalized race and racism, and how we have often applied it to other people of color. I think all groups really struggle under the idea of, and the reality of, white supremacy. And so I think it's this ongoing practice and process, and there is no kind of one size fits all way. Like, I don't even believe people are always anti-racist or you're just a racist. I think there's an ebb and a flow that exists between the two of those. I think of my mom, who is a white woman who has two Black children, who says racist things, and in her mind those things are not necessarily racist, but they are, and I think that this idea of being an anti-racist and really working towards that, again, it's a process, and it is a journey.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's
you seeing like around the country, like as you have those conversations.
Yes, well, and I think one of the questions that just came up for us in the chat is, how have Chicago Beyond and Spectrum, which is the convening that I mentioned at the beginning of the conference, focused around racial equity and reducing the racial wealth gap, pivoted during not only COVID, but now this urgent movement toward becoming anti-racist and then a more just society. So you, I believe, started answering part of that question. I think the other piece that I would say that I'm starting to hear is, which is why I asked my question around action. Just people are very much wanting to know what should I do, and not only individually but organizationally. And so lots of organizations trying to understand, how do I take the pandemic that we've already had, and then putting now riots and protests and the upheaval, how do I work as an organization, as a company, and how can we start to really think about not only our work, but our positioning and things that we should be saying or not saying. And so I think I'm definitely hearing a lot of that. And one of the things that I would say I mentioned on another call with, as I talked to not only some of our speakers that will be speaking next week, but then also individuals, it's really saying, this is a moment where we have to pause. And so often I think it's important for businesses and organizations to want to really quickly put messaging out or try to figure out how we are changing. But I also think it's really important to pause and be reflective and make sure that we are all being able to process the moment, because it's coming at all of us at very different levels. And we all individually make up organizations. And so until we can take a moment to process for ourselves, we're not being able to perhaps put out some of the best messaging or figure out how to start pivot or create programming that is really reflective of the moment. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with Spectrum. While we are, taking time each day to look at what has happened today and what do we need to change or alter, I think what we're also doing is really taking extra time as a team to sit and reflect and say, what am I feeling? And how does that need to be reflected or not in the programming and in the pieces that we are putting up and out into the world right now.
That's so true. I think sometimes that's the most, when things happen, we tend to look outward. But sometimes the most radical thing that we can do is, as you're describing, is pause and actually look at ourselves. And for those of us that are a part of organizations, is to look at our own organizations to see what structures and messages have we either intentionally or unintentionally propagated, and how do we shift. And that's where the real work happens, as opposed to the message of the statement of, what we want to say out to the world so we can be aligned to whatever the thing is, right? It's really about our own reflection. And I truly believe that's the moment essentially our country is in. Like, from my perspective, as I think about George Floyd, and his murder was absolutely horrific. I mean, this was one murder out of like a history of generations of murders of Black men and Black people, and the killing of Black souls. But this moment in particular, I believe, with his murder has become a reckoning moment for us, because as a country, we're doing what you and I were talking about. As a country, we're still, the coronavirus has essentially rendered us all still. We're not, hopping on that plane to do this or rushing around to this event or this thing, or, running around with the kids. Like, we're essentially all still, and we're forced to reflect on like who we are. And I think what we're seeing not only here in Chicago, but across the country, and honestly in cities across the world, as people are protesting against this, is people saying, we reflected and this is just not good enough, and it has to change, and it has to change now. And that is the revolution that we're seeing. And I think the only reason why it happened in the way that it has, honestly, is because we're still. And so there is power in stillness, and there is power in that reflection. Yeah. Where do you think we go from here, as you think about this next 30 days? Even I feel like things are changing.
It's funny. I was on a planning call right before this, and we were talking about something in July, and I was like, I honestly do not think I can plan that far out. I mean, I can have a plan, but that just seems like an eon from now.
Yeah.
But I think where we go from here, and I think we have to keep the focus and the fire lit under action, but like truly actionable ways where individuals, organizations are being able to make very short-term shifts that are allowing the larger system shift to begin. Because these are system level conversations. You know, we are not going to be able to change hundreds of years of, you know, bad decisions and poor policy in overnight. That is not realistic. And I think that that's the one thing that I've been talking about too. It's like we are in a long term, long game change, but that we need to start taking the small steps of movement toward that change right now. And so I think what I am continually looking for and wanting to surface and then also create for the field, particularly within the capital markets and, you know, founders of color, and then also those that have capital to place. It's just, how are you thinking about your missions differently? Not only if you are creating a company at this time, or if you are leading a company at this time, but then also with your capital, how are you thinking about using that capital to elevate not only these messages, but then elevate the work and transform the work. And so that is a lot of what I know I will be thinking and doing on. And I know that as an organization, SOCAP is also thinking and doing on that. And so many of our partners are. But I really hope we are calling in a time of greater purpose and really moving toward this inclusive and just economy that is also built around purpose and impact.
I do too. And I hope that as we think about investments overall, because there will need to be so many investments in our communities as we think about what is happening here, that we as a collective really understand the word risk and who's really taking the risk. I think so oftentimes, especially in philanthropy, but I think it happens in the business sector too, we say, you know, oh, that organization over there or that idea is too risky, and so we don't want to touch it. But really that's code for a whole bunch of other things. And I think there is an opportunity here as we think about investment, as we think about creating the future that you describe and about being in it for the long term, that we can do more than we've ever imagined we can do if we let go of some of those assumptions that we come to the table with, not just on racism, but on risk and all the things we've been talking about here today.
Mm-hmm. I have another question that I love, and I think it kind of will lead right in, but someone is asking, what gives you hope?
Our young people, like I've seen people out in the streets protesting, seen voices being uplifted and heard, seen that we are at the cusp of what I believe is the revolution that will take us into a new future. You know, as I mentioned at the top, I'm a former teacher and a principal, and so seeing our young people demanding something different and demanding a more just and equitable world gives me hope. How about for you? What gives you hope?
Yes, I would also say young people. Again, I have to go back to my daughter in elementary school, like just the idea that she and her friends will live in a different world. And I do believe a more just world. That gives me a lot of hope. But I would say I'm also finding a lot of hope in everyday moments. And I think that's another piece of with the pandemic, with so many of us being touched by death and loss in other ways, and just mourning the way that maybe business used to be, or the way you went grocery shopping, or I mean, just like there are so many things that we have to mourn. in order to be able to move to that next place.
Mhm.
But it's the moments of sheer resilience and
Mm.
creativity and just bravery and courage that we're also seeing every day over and over and over again, that are really deep reminders of our ability to be able to change, and for our ability to be able to do very difficult, um, not only choices, but revolutionary change, as you're saying, um, and that we truly have it in us and it's possible. And so I think those are the pieces that I continue to hold on to.
Yeah, the power has always been in the people. I've always said that. It's always, and we're getting a
Always.
chance to, we're getting a chance to actually see that, and hopefully the fruits of all of this will lead us off into a better place.
Absolutely. And I would say this has been really fast. We're kind of at our time already. And I think just as a, a parting question to you, um, you are presenting at Spectrum next week, and then I would also say that we are really honored to have Chicago Beyond as a sponsor. But part of that, I believe, was our, through a number of conversations, finding out that there was real room there, not only for synergy, but that there was partnership there, and that there was a lot of give and take. And so I'm really curious how you are thinking and doing and moving differently with partnerships and collaborations, and um, how you might be seeking something new or different going forward.
This is actually one of the things I'm really proud of as I think about Chicago Beyond and what it is we do and who we are and how we show up in the world. And maybe some of it has to do with how we were founded in my background as an educator and as an activist. But we have always rooted ourselves in community voice and not in this kind of top-down approach of like because we have resources, then therefore let us tell the folks we're giving resources what to do. But rather acknowledging the people that we are partnering with are experts, and how are we holding their voices center and creating space and light for others to know their voice and know their expertise. And so as I think about this moment in particular with COVID-19 and with everything that's happening, the fundamentals of that have not shifted for us.
Mm.
If anything, we are, and I feel honored that other people in our space and philanthropy and other places are coming to us to say, well, how do you do that? What does that actually look like in practice? And
Mm-hmm.
then we're able to talk about all of our missteps and all the places we messed up and all the things that we've done pretty well at, and then share that learning between those other organizations. And so that has been something that I think is very exciting for us, in that others too are thinking about how they show up in their authentic selves and create space and partnership in ways that just obliterate the power dynamics and get to the real root of the issue, which is communities, community voice, and making sure that all of us have the opportunity to be free. Because right now in our country, all of us are not free.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you, Carrie.
yeah, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to more conversations, and then particularly having you join us next week at Spectrum. And we do intend, not only this was kind of a beginning piece in stepping toward Spectrum, but then also we will continue to have more of these conversations following Spectrum, and then leading up to our larger event, SOCAP, in the fall. But I think the most important piece is ensuring that we continue to share information, and that we are circulating it, and that we are also moving out of our more comfortable, folks that we typically are doing and working with, to those next 2 to 3 layers out. So I'm really looking forward to more of the conversations and more of the content that we all create together.
Thanks so much, Carrie. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and we'll
You
see you
too.
soon.
Yeah, take good
Bye.
care. Bye.